me is Archie losing his first tooth this week, which is about to happen, and I just hope we're back home in time for it.
She seems to be obsessed with trying to overshadow Prince Louis's birthday. She does something every single year, but it's the fact that it was to do with his teeth missing.
Samantha Markle just threw a match on one of the most sensitive parts of Meghan's public image, Archie. And the reason this is hitting so hard is because she is not talking about some random headline or another recycled royal feud. She is pointing at Meghan's behavior around her own son and suggesting there is something far darker behind the image Meghan has tried to sell for years. That is why this is not just gossip. This lands like a direct attack on Meghan's character, her motives, and the story she has worked overtime to protect. And once Samantha opened that door, people started looking at everything differently. Something happened recently that stopped even the most seasoned royal watchers mid-scroll. Not because it was surprising, but because it was so calculated, so precisely timed, so breathtakingly on brand that it felt like watching someone detonate a grenade and then hand you a pamphlet explaining why they had no choice. The audacity of it demanded attention. The pattern behind it demanded a reckoning. Cast your eye across the Atlantic to the rolling countryside of Norfolk. The Prince and Princess of Wales had just given the world exactly what it needed. A moment of uncomplicated warmth. A little boy, 7 years old, perched on a log in golden woodland light, wearing a blue-checked shirt and grinning that enormous gap-toothed grin that only a child losing his baby teeth can produce. Prince Louis, caught in a single, perfect frame, radiating the kind of joy that has nothing to do with cameras or strategy or image management. It was pure. It was beautiful, and the world responded exactly the way you'd expect. Royal fans from Edinburgh to Sydney were sharing those photographs within the hour. Comment sections were overflowing, people remarking on how much he looks like his father, how fast he's grown, how that smile absolutely lights up a room. This was, by every measure, an uncontested moment belonging entirely to one little boy on his birthday. The spotlight was his, and he wore it effortlessly. Then, Meghan Markle walked onto a stage in New York City and made sure the spotlight moved.
I think a confession for you today that I could very comfortably say is I'm the happiest that I've ever been. And that part, to have a partner and a husband who is just so supportive and to have healthy kids that are so...
What followed was not a quiet news cycle. It ignited a wave of criticism from royal commentators, palace insiders, and people who have watched Meghan Markle operate up close for years. People who understand her playbook, not from tabloids, but from personal experience. People like her half-sister, Samantha Markle, who has been tracking this exact pattern for longer than most and who was unambiguous in her assessment. What happened that morning was not accidental, not incidental, and not remotely close to coincidence. We are going to walk through every piece of this. What Meghan did, why Samantha says it was a deliberate move, and what it exposes about the woman who has spent years constructing a very specific version of herself for public consumption. Because when you line up the facts, the timing, the platform, the statements, the contradictions, the portrait that emerges is not flattering. It is extraordinary in the worst possible way. But first, you need to understand the full weight of what Prince Louis's birthday photographs actually represent, not just as a royal tradition, but as a cultural institution. Every year, Catherine releases carefully composed images of her children on their birthdays. This is not a press obligation. It is a gift. A tradition that royal fans plan around, that newspapers hold front pages for, that social media celebrates with a warmth that cuts across political lines and national borders. People who have never set foot in Britain stop what they're doing to look at those photographs. That is how beloved this ritual has become. This year, Catherine delivered something exceptional. Louis photographed in that Norfolk woodland, natural light filtering through the trees, that unforgettable smile front and center. Within 60 minutes of publication, those images had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Royal correspondents were running out of superlatives. It was Louis's day, completely, unambiguously, undeniably his. And on that same morning, as those photographs were circling the globe, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry touched down in New York City for the Time 100 Summit. Same morning, same news cycle. You decide what to make of that. Now, there are people who will tell you that the timing was simply a coincidence. That Meghan had been locked in as a Time 100 speaker weeks before anyone was thinking about Louis's birthday portraits. That the schedule was public, the dates were set, and there was nothing calculated about any of it. And yes, that version of events is technically possible. What it is not, however, is remotely believable to anyone who has paid attention to how this woman operates. Because we are not talking about an amateur here. We are not talking about someone who stumbled into the public eye and is still finding her footing. Meghan Markle is one of the most media-literate, strategically precise, image-conscious operators in the entire celebrity landscape. She has spent the better part of a decade studying how coverage works, how narratives get built, how one story can drown out another simply by landing on the same morning. The idea that she, with a full professional PR apparatus behind her, simply did not notice what date she had accepted is not a defense. For people who have watched her this closely for this long, it is an insult to their intelligence. She arrived at that event dressed with deliberate precision. A tan linen suit, crisp white button-down, every detail calibrated to project exactly the image she has been relentlessly constructing. The polished founder, the serious businesswoman, the woman who walked away from a crown and built something better. Harry was beside her, as he reliably is whenever the cameras are present, and for a brief, extraordinary window that morning, the world was holding two completely different stories in the same news cycle at the same time. Birthday portraits of a little boy in Norfolk, the Sussexes touching down in Manhattan, both images competing for the same front pages. And then Meghan walked onto that stage, and the story pivoted entirely.
So joyful in the freeness of their life and the safety of their life that we create for them. I never, of all the things that have happened in my life, I never would have imagined getting here at this point. I would feel just so happy and grateful, and I really do.
She was interviewed by the Time CEO, and the conversation opened exactly the way Meghan's conversations always seem to open, with a carefully positioned personal disclosure. The format gave her an easy lane. She was asked to make a confession in keeping with the spirit of her podcast, Confessions of a Female Founder. And Meghan, who has never once been caught without a prepared answer, delivered one with a wide smile and total composure. She said, and these were her actual words, that she is the happiest she has ever been. That after everything she has lived through, everything that has happened, she could never have imagined arriving at this place feeling this full of joy and this grateful for her life. The room applauded. The audience smiled. And every royal watcher with a laptop open started typing immediately. Because you have to sit with that statement. The happiest she has ever been. Not one of the happiest moments. The happiest, full stop. Happier than the day she married a prince in a ceremony broadcast to millions across the world. Happier than the moments her children were born. Happier, she is telling us, than at any other point in her 43 years of life. That is the claim on the table. And the fact that she made it, beaming, polished, on a global stage, on the same morning that the child she and Harry walked away from was celebrating his birthday, is something this audience is going to have a very strong opinion about. And that claim matters even more when you hold it against what she told the world not so long ago. Because that Oprah interview is the foundation everything else has to be measured against. That is where Meghan sat, composed and tearful in alternating doses, and told a global audience that the institution of the royal family had broken her. That she had been so consumed by despair she could barely function. That she had begged for help and been turned away. That she had felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Those were the terms she set. That was the version of events she chose to present to the world. Not in a private journal, not in a whispered conversation, but on camera, in prime time, to one of the most watched interviewers on earth. So when she now steps onto a stage and announces that she is the happiest she has ever been in 43 years of living, she is not simply sharing a positive update. She is, whether she intends to or not, walking directly back into the wreckage of everything she previously claimed. Because those two statements cannot both be fully true at the same time. Either the suffering she described to Oprah was as consuming and genuine as she presented it, or this new happiness she is advertising so freely tells a very different story about the severity of what came before. And the audience watching both performances is not missing that tension. They see it clearly. Was the Oprah interview exaggerated? Was the breakdown performed? Was the isolation, the desperation, the edge of the cliff language, was any of it as real as it was delivered? These are not unfair questions. These are the questions that arise naturally when the same person who claimed to be shattered by a life inside the royal family turns around and declares that life has never been better. Samantha Markle has had pointed things to say about exactly this kind of pattern. But we will get there. Because first, we need to talk about the moment that detonated across the internet within hours of Meghan leaving that stage.
Equally important to me is Archie losing his first tooth this week, which is about to happen, and I just hope we're back home in time for it.
It was toothless, and that's what was going around because he looked absolutely adorable, and lots of people were talking about his toothless grin. Now all of a sudden, it just happened to be the exact same day that Archie is losing his tooth.
During her on-stage conversation, Meghan mentioned Archie. Specifically, she mentioned his teeth, that he is on the verge of losing his first tooth that week, and that she was desperately hoping to be back home in time to witness it. She said it warmly, laughingly, with the practiced ease of a woman who knows exactly how that kind of detail lands with an audience. And it landed exactly as intended. The coverage was immediate and gushing. Devoted Duchess rushing home for son's milestone moment. Meghan's sweet confession about Archie's tooth. Warm, maternal, disarming. Precisely the image her team had been working to construct, and the media delivered it on cue, without a single follow-up question. But here is where the story stops being charming and starts being something else entirely. Because on that very same morning, photographs of Prince Louis had already been seen by millions of people worldwide. His birthday portraits, full of that enormous gap-toothed grin, those missing front teeth on full and joyful display, had already swept through every major outlet. Louis's missing teeth were not a footnote. They were the headline. They were being described as one of the most endearing details of his entire birthday set. Every royal correspondent, every entertainment feed, every casual royal watcher was already talking about a child's missing teeth before Meghan Markle walked onto that stage. And within hours of those images going viral across the globe, Meghan was at a microphone in New York bringing up her own child's teeth.
There's no way she raised that tooth line without knowing about Louis.
No, she was in the car as she arrived, and she would have been searching social media because I do not believe her saying that she doesn't listen to it all. She gets notified.
You may call that coincidence. You are welcome to. But let us actually sit inside that coincidence for a moment and look at it directly. On the one day in the entire calendar year when a royal child's missing teeth are dominating international headlines, Meghan Markle chooses a global platform to raise the subject of her own child's missing tooth. On the single morning when Prince Louis's birthday has already flooded every royal news cycle on Earth, Meghan's name is inserted into that exact same conversation. Teeth, children, milestones, maternal warmth, through a detail that required nothing more than the decision to mention it. The overlap is not subtle. It is precise. And precision like that does not typically emerge from coincidence. Samantha Markle doesn't think it does either, and she has made that position very clear. Samantha has spent years occupying one of the most uncomfortable positions imaginable. She is the half-sister of one of the most relentlessly scrutinized, strategically managed women on the planet, and she has watched the machinery up close in a way that very few people have. She grew up in the same household. She watched Meghan climb through Hollywood, watched the fairy tale wedding, watched the global brand get constructed piece by piece. And what Samantha says she has watched with increasing clarity is the gap, the ever-widening distance between the Meghan being presented to the world and the Meghan she says she actually knows. That gap, she insists, is not incidental. It is the product of deliberate, sustained image management. Samantha has been publicly and consistently critical for years. There are people who want to write her off as a bitter sibling, someone left in the shadow while her half-sister ascended to international stardom and married into the most famous family on Earth. But here is what her supporters return to, again and again. The patterns she identified early have proven out. The warnings she issued before the world was paying attention have landed. She is not just venting. She is not performing grievance. She is, by her own account, describing what she watched from the inside. And the record suggests she has been right more often than her critics want to admit. So when Samantha looked at what happened on Prince Louis's birthday, the New York summit, the stage appearance, the tooth comment, she was not shocked. She was not even particularly surprised. She was, if anything, resigned. Because she says she has seen this exact playbook run before, multiple times, across multiple occasions. The pattern, as Samantha frames it, is this. Meghan has a finely tuned instinct for locating a spotlight that is pointed somewhere else and walking into the frame. It does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it is a well-placed personal anecdote that happens to mirror whatever the news cycle is already emotionally invested in. A story that surfaces at exactly the right moment. A detail that seems organic but lands with surgical precision. But on Louis's birthday, Samantha says the move was not subtle at all. Bringing up a child's tooth, specifically a tooth, on the same day the world was already celebrating a gap-toothed royal child's birthday portrait was not coincidence. In Samantha's reading, it was a calculated redirect, a deliberate insertion into a moment that belonged entirely to someone else. And the fact that it worked, that people talked about it, that it generated exactly the kind of coverage it generated, that, she argues, is not accidental either. That is the point. And to understand why so many people took this criticism seriously, you have to zoom out. Because this was not, according to those who have tracked Meghan's public moves closely, a one-off lapse in judgment. It was part of a documented series of choices where the timing is never quite accidental and the collision with someone else's moment is never quite explained. Go back to when Harry and Meghan announced their decision to step back from royal duties. There was no warning, no coordination, no quiet conversation with the palace before the statement dropped. This was standard protocol, the bare minimum of institutional courtesy, and it was completely bypassed. The announcement detonated in the middle of what should have been a stable period for the monarchy, and it left the palace scrambling to respond in real time, publicly, to a bombshell they had not been given a single hour to prepare for. Then came the Oprah interview. The timing of that broadcast has never been adequately explained by Harry or Meghan, and yet the timing tells you everything. It aired while Prince Philip was gravely ill. The country was already bracing itself. The palace was already under the weight of what was coming. And into that moment, Harry and Meghan launched a 2-hour primetime broadcast containing some of the most serious allegations ever leveled against the royal family. Allegations the institution was then forced to publicly address while simultaneously preparing to lose the Queen's husband of 73 years. The overlap was not a scheduling conflict. Nobody is that careless with a production of that scale. And then there was the Netflix documentary, which arrived during the very same week the new Princess of Wales was making her first significant solo overseas engagement. A moment that should have belonged entirely to her, a debut on the world stage. Instead, the documentary pulled focus. The coverage fractured. And once again, the question hung in the air unanswered. Why that week? But there is another figure in this story who has been quietly demanding closer examination. Someone who stood just off stage while Meghan commanded the room. Someone whose presence at these events has become increasingly difficult to interpret the longer you look at it. That person is Prince Harry. Harry was in New York. He attended the summit alongside his wife. And that is very nearly the entirety of what there is to say about his participation. Because this was Meghan's event in every meaningful sense. Her speech, her spotlight, her carefully constructed moment. The man who was once, by any objective measure, the more recognizable half of this partnership, the one who was, after all, an actual member of the British royal family, has been methodically repositioned over the years into something that should make anyone paying attention deeply uncomfortable. He stands slightly behind her now. He speaks less. He smiles when directed, applauds at the correct intervals, and fades into the background of his own public appearances. In Hollywood terms, he is the supportive husband, the accessory, the backup. One commentator covering the summit put it with devastating precision. Harry has been made the spare all over again. Only this time, not by the palace, but by his own wife. And that detail carries real weight, because Harry did not walk away from the monarchy quietly. He did not simply resign and disappear. He made a public spectacle of his departure, citing invisibility, irrelevance, the unbearable experience of being reduced to a supporting role behind his brother. He said he felt overlooked, sidelined, stripped of identity. Those were his words. And yet there he stood in New York, in Ralph Lauren, watching Meghan take center stage, clapping at the right moments, wearing an expression that more than one observer described as something less than a man who has found what he was looking for. Now step back and look at the full strategic picture. Because Meghan's appearance at this summit was never just a speech. It was a precision-engineered PR operation. And once you identify the moving pieces, the intent becomes almost clinical in its clarity. At this stage, Meghan had significant ground to recover. Her Netflix show had aired to reviews that ranged from lukewarm to openly contemptuous. Her lifestyle brand had launched to a reception that mixed genuine enthusiasm with sustained public ridicule. Her podcast was still finding its footing. She was, in the bluntest possible terms, mid-rebuild. And she needed the kind of coverage that reasserted her relevance, reestablished her credibility, and reminded the world that she was a figure worth treating seriously. The Time 100 Summit was not a coincidence of opportunity. It was the perfect vehicle. High profile, prestigious, photographed and syndicated globally. exactly the stage a calculated comeback requires. And that calculation extended to every detail of how she entered that room, because what that room represented, and what Meghan understood it to represent the moment she walked through the door, was the entire point. The Time 100 Summit guest list was not assembled casually. These were not influencers and minor celebrities padding out a networking event. We are talking about Netflix executives, A-list Hollywood talent, celebrated philanthropists with genuine global impact, people who have built something, people who have earned something. And there was Meghan, moving through that room as though she belonged in the same category, positioned by proximity, photographed alongside achievement, absorbing credibility by association. That is how the strategy works. You do not announce relevance. You manufacture the optics of it and let the cameras do the rest. Every single thing she said on that stage was engineered to answer a specific charge. Not generally. Specifically. She is happy, and that is a direct counter to months of coverage framing the Sussex operation as fractured and increasingly desperate. She is a devoted mother that lands directly against the whispers that have followed her for years about the gap between her public warmth and her private reality. She is grateful, a surgical strike against the entitlement narrative that has clung to her since the Oprah interview. She is thriving, delivered with a smile straight into the face of every analyst who has spent the last 18 months watching the Sussex brand stall and sputter. This was not a speech. It was a point-by-point rebuttal dressed up as inspiration. And then there was the Archie tooth moment. Royal commentators have called it the most elegant maneuver of the entire appearance, and they are right. Because what do you do with it? What does anyone do with a mother mentioning her child's lost tooth? You cannot attack it. You cannot dismiss it. It is designed to be bulletproof. But make no mistake about what it actually accomplished. It dropped Meghan's name directly into the trending news cycle of that morning, wrapped in the softest, most sympathetic packaging imaginable. Missing teeth. Royal children. Meghan. All circulating together, all feeding each other, all building reach. That is not maternal warmth leaking into a public appearance. That is a press strategy wearing maternal warmth as a costume. Now we have to address what critics, and specifically Samantha Markle, have explicitly called out as dishonest. Because that word matters, and it deserves to be handled with full seriousness rather than brushed aside. The allegation is not complicated. It is that the version of Meghan presented on that stage, the ever-present, emotionally available, milestone-prioritizing mother, does not match the operational reality of the last 2 years. Look at the actual calendar. The podcast rollout, the Netflix production schedule, the brand launch, the galas, the summits, multiple New York trips, 2 within weeks of each other at one point. This is not the schedule of someone who has restructured their life around presence and availability. This is the schedule of someone building an empire and occasionally invoking their children as character evidence. Archie and Lilibet appear publicly only when it serves a purpose. A photograph placed carefully, a mention dropped at exactly the right moment. They are simultaneously the proof of Meghan's devotion and the most tightly controlled element of her entire media operation. Samantha Markle has said it plainly and repeatedly that Meghan has always possessed an extraordinary ability to perform closeness and warmth, to project an image of presence that does not always reflect what is actually happening. That underneath every public mention of her children, there is a calculation running. That is a damning thing to say. It is also, given everything this audience has watched unfold over the past several years, not remotely easy to dismiss. But there is a layer to this that almost never gets the attention it deserves. The children. Archie is 6 years old. Lilibet is 3. They made no choices. They consented to nothing. They did not select the controversy that surrounded their arrival. Did not vote to be raised thousands of miles from their grandparents, their cousins, their father's entire heritage and homeland. They cannot comprehend the machine they were born into, and yet from almost the very beginning, they have functioned as instruments, deployed when useful, protected when not, managed like assets in a brand portfolio they will not understand for years. And that deployment is not incidental. It is not accidental. Because Archie is not just a child caught in the crossfire of his parents' choices. He is a child who has been positioned repeatedly and deliberately as a plot device in a story Meghan is still writing. The controversies surrounding him did not begin when he could walk or talk. They began before he drew his first breath. The questions about his title, the christening conducted behind closed doors while the press was told to stand down. And then, most explosively, the Oprah interview, where the color of a baby's skin was introduced into a global conversation, weaponized into evidence of royal racism before that child was old enough to understand what racism even means. He was an infant, and he was already a headline. Now he is 6 years old, and the pattern has not stopped. It has simply evolved to match his age. A missing tooth. One of the most quietly beautiful, completely unremarkable milestones of early childhood. The kind of moment that happens in kitchens and school hallways and bedtime routines all over the world, with no cameras, no audience, no narrative attached. But in Meghan's world, nothing escapes deployment. That moment, that tiny, tender, utterly private development was delivered to a room full of cameras at a high-profile public event engineered from the ground up for maximum media saturation. And we are supposed to believe it just came up. We are supposed to believe it was spontaneous. Meghan does not do spontaneous. Every word she speaks in public has been weighed. Every anecdote she shares has been selected. This was a choice. It served a purpose on that particular day. And the purpose, as it so often is, was attention. But here's the thing about children. They grow up faster than any PR strategy accounts for. Archie will not be 6 forever. One day, probably sooner than anyone in that California compound is prepared for, he will be old enough to type his own name into a search engine. He will read the interviews, he will find the footage, he will understand, with complete clarity, exactly how his childhood was packaged and presented and what it was used to accomplish. That is a reckoning that no publicist can spin and no carefully worded Netflix documentary can soften. Now look at what the palace did, or more precisely, what it chose not to do. Buckingham Palace said nothing. Kensington Palace said nothing. William and Catherine released their photographs of Prince Louis, marked the day with the warmth and simplicity the occasion deserved, and did not utter a single syllable about what was unfolding across the Atlantic. And that silence was not absence. That silence was a statement. Responding to Meghan gives Meghan what Meghan needs most: confirmation that she still registers, that her movements still cause a reaction inside those ancient walls. The palace understands this. So the palace went quiet, and in doing so, demonstrated more composure and more institutional intelligence than anything Harry and Meghan produced that entire week. Those close to the institution have been consistent on this point. The monarchy has stood for 1,000 years. It has outlasted crises that would have destroyed lesser structures. It will outlast this. And the British public's deep and genuine loyalty to the working royals has not been shaken. But that does not mean the wounds are not real. It does not mean the timing of a certain New York appearance on a certain birthday went unnoticed by the people inside those institutions who notice absolutely everything. They noticed. They always notice. Which brings us to Samantha Markle, and why her voice matters in ways that go well beyond family grievance. Because Samantha has not simply been reacting to individual events as they surface. She has been, across years of interviews, a book, and countless public statements, building a case. A consistent, detailed, structurally coherent argument about who her half-sister fundamentally is. And that argument does not rest on any single incident. It rests on a pattern that Samantha says she watched develop over decades, long before the palace, long before Harry, long before any of us were paying attention. The core of what Samantha argues is this: that for Meghan, occupying the center of the story is not a preference or a personality quirk. It is a compulsion. A need so deep and so constant that it does not switch off when the cameras go away, because for Meghan, the cameras never really go away. They are always there, even when they are not. Every room is a stage. Every relationship is an audience. Every milestone, including a 6-year-old's lost tooth, is material. Samantha does not frame this as a flaw among many. She frames it as the organizing principle of her half-sister's entire identity. Something structural, something that was there long before fame. And that fame did not create, it simply amplified to a scale the rest of the world could finally see. And here is where Samantha's account stops being a family grievance and becomes something far more significant. Because what she is describing is not a phase Meghan grew out of. It is not a coping mechanism she developed under the pressure of royal life. It is a pattern that was already fully formed before any of this began. Rooted in childhood, in the specific way that love and validation were competed for in the environment Meghan grew up in. Samantha's argument is that attention was the currency, that performing for whoever was in the room, even just the immediate family, was how approval was earned and held onto. That is the foundation she is describing. Not ambition, not drive. Something older and more instinctive than either of those things. And the argument that follows from that is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because Samantha does not claim that Meghan operates on cold, deliberate strategy. She claims something more unsettling than that. She says the drive to center herself, to redirect attention, to occupy the narrative, It does not feel like calculation to Meghan. It is so deeply embedded, so thoroughly wired into how she moves through the world that it happens without conscious design. It is reflexive, automatic, as instinctive as breathing. What it means is that there is no version of Meghan Markle who simply decides to stop. There is no intervention, no conversation, no reconciliation framework that rewires something operating at that level. The behavior does not require a plan. It just requires her presence. Now, we should be precise about what we can and cannot say with certainty. We cannot know exactly what King Charles feels when he watches his younger son standing quietly at the edge of his wife's public appearances. We cannot put words or emotions to Prince William's private experience when yet another news cycle that was supposed to belong to his family gets pulled off course by something surfacing from California. What we can say, and say with confidence, is that the fracture between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family is not healing. It is not narrowing. If anything, with every passing month, the distance calcifies further. The reunion so many hoped for has not arrived, and it looks less likely now than it did a year ago. King Charles, by credible accounts, has not entirely closed the door on his son. There are sources who describe something still paternal in his posture toward Harry, a tenderness that survives even through bewilderment and real, lasting hurt. But the palace's terms have never been ambiguous. Harry would need to return. He would need to re-engage with royal life in some meaningful, demonstrable way. And most critically, the sustained public campaign against the institution, the interviews, the documentary, the memoir, the steady drip of grievance, would need to stop. None of that is imminent, not even close. Harry's life is in California. His children are rooted there, and Meghan's entire constructed identity, every brand partnership, every platform, every carefully curated reinvention, rests entirely on the story of two people who escaped a cold and cruel institution and built something better on their own terms. That narrative is the product. That narrative is the business. To return to the fold, even partially, would be to crack the foundation of everything they have monetized. It would signal, without ever having to say it aloud, that the story they sold the world was incomplete, that the institution they condemned was not quite what they described, that the wounds they performed for global audiences were not the whole picture. And for someone whose entire architecture, personal, professional, and public, is built on controlling how her story is told, that admission may simply be a price that can never be paid. Pull back far enough, and what happened on Prince Louis's birthday is not a footnote. It is a microcosm. A single, clean illustration of a dynamic that has been unfolding in one form or another since the moment Meghan Markle first entered Harry's world, and by extension, all of ours. That dynamic, it should be said, is not complicated. It never was. On one side sits an institution defined by restraint, a family that released a photograph of a little boy on a log, let that image carry its own quiet warmth, and asked the world for nothing beyond a shared moment of celebration. No statement, no positioning, no narrative management. Just a child's birthday, offered simply and with dignity. On the other side stands Meghan Markle, a woman for whom no public moment appears to arrive without calculation. No spotlight appears to land without having first been angled correctly. No story seems to reach the world without having passed through a filter she herself controls. Samantha Markle has described this as instinct as much as strategy. And that distinction matters because it makes the behavior harder to argue away. You can defend a single calculated move. You can dismiss one piece of unfortunate timing. But when the behavior runs so deep, it may no longer even register as a choice. When the mechanism fires automatically, the way it appears to have fired the moment the world's attention turned toward a little boy named Louis. That is something else entirely. That is character. And character, as this story has demonstrated over and over again, is the one thing that cannot be rebranded. Meghan would reject all of this. She would tell you she was simply fulfilling a prior commitment. She would say she talks about her children because she is a mother, and mothers talk about their children. She would frame every appearance, every interview soundbite, every conveniently timed disclosure as nothing more than an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. And if the cameras happen to follow, that is their business, not hers. That is the version of events she prefers. That is the story she has been telling for years. But you have been watching long enough to know what the raw record shows, and the raw record does not align with the preferred narrative. Prince Louis turned 7 years old. Somewhere in Montecito, around that same window of time, Archie Harrison lost his first tooth. One of those events was a private childhood milestone, tender and fleeting. The other was a royal milestone shared with an entire nation through a single understated photograph. And yet, both stories landed in the same news cycle, because Meghan made certain of that. Because for Meghan, there is no such thing as a moment too small to broadcast, no milestone too intimate to deploy, no occasion so clearly belonging to someone else that she cannot find a way to place herself in its orbit. 2 boys, 2 missing teeth, 2 childhoods being lived out in dramatically different registers, one in full public view at Windsor, one being narrated to global media from a California stage. Samantha Markle's position has never wavered. She says she is watching a woman who has spent her entire life engineering the world's gaze toward herself, and who cannot stop doing it even when the world's gaze was never hers to claim. Whether that reads to you as ambition, as damage, or simply as consequence playing out in slow motion, the pattern is undeniable. And at this point, the pattern is the verdict. If you've been watching this story unfold and you knew from the beginning how it would end, you belong here. Palace Leaks covers what the mainstream press is too polite to say plainly. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is far from over, and every new chapter proves the point.